The police always come late if they come at all. And when they arrive, they say they can't interfere with domestic affairs between a man and his wife. And as they walk out the door, the tears well up in her eyes. Last night I heard the screaming, then a silence that chilled my soul. Prayed that I was dreaming when I saw the ambulance in the road. And the policeman said, I'm here to keep the peace. Will the crowd disperse? I think we all could use some sleep. Last night I heard the screaming, loud voices behind the wall. Another sleepless night for me, it won't do no good to call the police. Always come late if they come at all.
Hello everybody, welcome to Voices from the Diaspora again. It's me, Kadi Mansuri, and I am presenting this week's show, which is on domestic violence. I have here a very distinguished panel comprising of people from the diaspora, very active and passionate Sierra Leoneans. We've got Amy Sherry, who's from the UK, and she's an activist, very passionate about female and gender issues. Amy, do you want to say hello to our listeners?
Hello, I am Amy, and I'm here to talk about domestic violence.
And we've got Adrian Fisher from the UK, and he's a lawyer, also very passionate about domestic violence issues.
Hello, listeners.
And Nemesh Tajuddin from the USA, a PhD student, also very passionate about the issue.
I am Nene.
And last but not the least, Isata Mahoy, another PhD student in Italy, and another person very passionate about domestic violence.
Hi, listeners. I am Isata Mahoy.
Okay, listeners, well, as you see, I cannot say enough how passionate all these members of the panel are about domestic violence. The very first thing we're going to be talking about is the Domestic Violence Act. What are the legal implications and how can this be effectively implemented? So, in short, the Domestic Violence Act was passed a few years ago in Sierra Leone, and it introduced, it made domestic violence an offense, a criminal offense, and so basically it's not okay to beat up your wife anymore. It's not okay to beat up anyone in a domestic situation. The government also makes it possible for the government to provide temporary safe homes for victims, if necessary, excluding men. So that's the law. Adrian, would you like to talk more about the legal implications of this and how it can be effectively implemented?
Yes, thank you very much, Kadi, for your question. Now, I think one of the things that we need to bear in mind when we talk about the Domestic Violence Act, I noticed that you use the phrase, it's not right for men to beat up their wives. But the law, as it stands, does not simply apply to men beating up their wives. It also applies to women as well who beat up their husbands or alternatively the boyfriends. So it works apparently in both ways. But I think what we need to look at to make sure we get a proper understanding of what the law is about is what is domestic violence in law. You know, most of us know domestic violence to simply be an issue of, the husband beat up the wife and that's it, but it's much more than that. The Act specifies what the abuse actually is, and it makes reference to issues of physical or sexual abuse. It talks about economic abuse. For example, a husband who is the breadwinner of the family deciding that he's not going to provide enough food for his family. That all comes under domestic domestic violence. Also, emotional abuse, verbal abuse, what we normally refer to as cos, harassment, sexual harassment, intimidation, forms under domestic violence, conduct that exposes the other person to harm or health-wise, for example, safety, undermines privacy, integrity, security, or conduct as well that seems to suggest that one partner is less dignified than the other partner. So these are all issues that are set out in the domestic violence law. So it's not just simply a question of, physical abuse, slapping around, as we normally call it. It involves all of these other aspects. And also, it's insofar as the reach of domestic violence is concerned, the law makes provision for what is referred to as a domestic relationship. So, in other words, we're not just talking about husband and wife. We can look at a situation where people are living together. They're not married, but they're living together as husband and wife. It extends to a house help. For example, your nanny at home doing your washing. That comes under domestic relationship as well. The parents, for example, of one of the parties concerned is included in the definition. Even if you're living in a house with other co-tenants that you don't even know or you're not even related to in any way, if there are issues of course, sexual harassment, emotional, verbal abuse, all of the things I talked about involving those co-tenants, that all comes under domestic relationship. And of course, parents and child as well are involved in domestic relationships. So you see, the Act makes provision for a wide reach of persons that are related to one another in terms of adoption, in terms of affinity, in terms of consanguinity as well. So all of these issues are part of the law. So if we look at domestic violence, we're going to look at it from that context. So now, what the law does is, sorry, yes, go on, Kadi.
I was going to ask, how can it be effectively implemented?
Right, the effective implementation of the Domestic Violence Act. I mean, my experience of this act is that it has not been properly implemented from the start of it. I mean, it is a good piece of legislation, but it does have some flaws in it. But the implementation has been very weak, because for the implementation of this act to work properly, number one, you need to educate members of the public about the act. That was not properly done. It was a question of just saying, oh yes, we now have this Domestic Violence Act. It's illegal for a husband to beat his wife, and that's the end of it. No proper education was done. So many people are not even aware of the existence of the act or what the provisions of the act are there for. So that's number one. Secondly, the police, they need to be trained properly insofar as this act is concerned. And of course, the attitudes of the police as we speak have been responsible for the failure of the act to be implemented properly. Then we have the third problem as well, which is that of the courts. The courts have not, effectively carried out the implementation of this act. And part of the problem is there have not been any specific instances where the court say, right, we are going to fast-track issues of domestic violence and deal with them properly. They are put in amongst the general court cases that come to court. So looking at the Sierra Leone legal system as it is with its constant adjournments, a domestic violence case coming to court, which should be dealt with pretty quickly, would end up being in court for 6 to 8 to 9 months, which then effectively frustrates all the parties, and by which time the effective means of protection provided in the Act is lost. So I believe that those are the three areas that needs to be strengthened if we're going to have any effective implementation of this Act.
Thank you very much, Adrian. That was like a really brilliant explanation in very simple terms of what the Act is all about, how broad the scope is, and also, the shortcomings that we have. Amy, can you add what you think about this? What, in addition to what Adrian has said, how do you think it can be effectively implemented, and what, from a woman's point of view, are the legal implications? And also, is there anything else that you may want to add on in addition to Adrian's.
Right, thank you very much, Kade. Yes, in addition to what Adrian has just put forward, we as a woman, I'm speaking from the woman's perspective here, we should really say we've done a lot of progress in this area, especially having to implement the Domestic Violence Act in 2007. It sort of like gives us a headway on what we should be able to achieve a zero tolerance in this aspect. However, for domestic violence to fully meet its criminal status, there are certain issues that have not quite been addressed, especially things to do with enforcement, like Adrian said. The law can be there, it can be well written, but it has to be implemented accordingly. For instance, we have issues with levying fines, with a 5 million fine for a perpetrator or a 2 years imprisonment term. These are all good. They all sound good in papers. Well, one thing we tend to skip quite often, before a case goes through court, it has to go through a formalized process. In that sense, there are necessary steps the victims must take before you go through court stage and get the perpetrator fined or imprisoned. In that way, what I'm trying to say here is that talking about that would set a precedent for domestic violence in a harassment sense or physical and sexual abuse or economical abuse sense. If somebody is going, let's look at it from the perspective of our cultural domain. If a man is going to marry a woman and is expected to pay dowry, in not so broad sense, he's been told that he's buying a woman. In as much as we all know, it's just a sign of, it's a mark of respect to the families. But a man in our own African way will think, I've possessed a property, and it would create a culture of, I would do as I please, quote unquote. That's where we have one of the issues that we should be addressing. In addition to that, to break that kind of behavior, we would need a grassroots approach, i.e., talk things over the radio, educate people, and basically get the police to do their work. But before the police can do the work, there are other issues, because when I recently learned that if you're going to report a domestic violence, you need to be able to show, especially a physical abuse, you need to be able to show proof, a medical proof. And when victims do turn up at the hospitals, they're expected to pay exorbitant amount of money. And quite often in our societies, women are economically poor. How can you expect a woman in such a situation to be able to pay a medical bill, which of course she can simply go back home and sit down and just forget about whatever's happened, and it's a repeat of another woman's problem, and it just becomes a cultural thing, and it just sort of slips within the system. I think I would add later on as we go along, Kadi.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks a lot. That is really good. Thank you very much, Adrian and Amy. I am sure our listeners are out there, and some of us will be quaking in our shoes to really understand what it is that we are doing that's not right. But you raised some points that are very valid, and they just tie on neatly with my next question, which I'd like to direct to Nene. How do you think we can overcome traditional beliefs? Because, as Amy said earlier, it seems to be at the core of our problems. You know, a lot of these things, starting from a man getting married and thinking he owns the wife, she's a piece of property, and leading from there how he treats her and how society treats the situation. So how can we change the mindset?
I know that's a difficult question, but thanks, Amy and the panel, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. First, I think what we need to do is